Welcome to Potentiality, a space for big questions, deep conversations, and shared wisdom around the most meaningful thing we do as human beings, which is how we parent and educate the next generation. Today's guest works at the intersection of systems, education, and human-centered design. Asad Bandeali is the founder of A-Spark Consulting, where he helps organizations turn ideas into systems that actually work for people, grounded in dignity, inclusion, and real-world impact. He's also been a part of global conversations on AI and education, including recent work in Doha exploring how we prepare young people to engage with AI in thoughtful and responsible ways. And that is the topic for today's conversation. Welcome, Asad. It's great to have you here in this space.
Thank you so much. It's so good to be here.
You work across different sectors, child welfare, healthcare, and education, and often at the intersection of systems and human-centered design. Today, I want to invite you to share your perspective on social impact through the lens of education. But before we start that, I would like to know what led you to this work and what did you begin to see about different systems and particularly education, how it shapes human development and experience. What is your journey to the work that you do today?
Absolutely, absolutely. This is such a fundamental question. As we talk about education, thinking about our own journey into the world of education and professionally and personally. And so my journey into working within education started from a very young age when I was really interested in physiology and neurobiology, really behavior. And that led to me becoming a scientist. I was a bio major and researcher working in many different capacity. However, something within me felt it wasn't enough. And so I wanted to do more creative work. And as a result, I started a fellowship a number of years ago with Experience Institute. Within that year, the entire idea was how do I work at the intersection of design and education? And that year, I worked with a number of different education-based organizations from Design Tech High School to Stanford's D.school K-12 lab, worked with an agency focused on project-based curriculum design, as well as working with nonprofits that have educational hubs in Uganda. And so that gave me an exposure to different ways of educating families, communities, and students across a variety of different modules and methodologies, really. And so what became clear is that we ourselves are learning at all times, and we're doing this work. And so that systems question that you asked, what we see within education, um, it's that aspect of developing the human side of an individual, something that is deep down, something that you can't always see, but you always know that's there and you feel it as the truth.
Thank you for sharing your story. I think it's always important for people to understand how we come to do the work that we do, especially if we're on an aligned path for ourselves, because I feel it's never by accident. It's that deep drive that leads you to making the contribution that you need to make at whatever scale that is. It's interesting. My journey into education started more with the academic focus. I grew up in the family of a university dean and a university professor. And for me, it was all about academics. And only after 20 years in the field, I've started really getting interested into the human side of things. Like, what type of human beings are we actually educating? Because so many of them, even if they're successful academically, if some human capacities are not in place, we're still not preparing them for the success that they need and that they're looking for to get through the education systems. And this is where my journey to coaching and consulting became more practical and has kind of taken priority in my own personal career. Because what I found is education systems are often designed for efficiency, standardization, and outcomes, very performance driven. And many students, they learn how to perform, yet they do not feel fully seen and supported. So, in your opinion and in your view, having done all the work that you've done for different organizations, where do you see educational systems, particularly the main industrial system, most often fails young people, not academically again, but in how they shape their humanity?
Absolutely. It's such a fundamental question. as you mentioned, education system is really designed for output, right? And so we think about the human or the student as a workforce component, and they're coming in to learn. And this education system was designed during industrial age for an output. And nowadays, as we're thinking about this component of AI, the output component is starting to shift. The landscape is shifting. And so I want to describe how I see the students um, journey through education from a lens of a student I worked with. Let's call her Rachel.
Mm,
Rachel was working within a school, a K-12 school, so within the high school, and within that, she was full of ideas. She was curious. She did come from a low-income family, and in a school that was focused on all STEM. She was very interested in dance. And so I ran a project there called Curiosity Project, which was really designed to nurture this curiosity within students and help them pursue a passion project. Um,
mm,
she was great at her academics, but there was something else to her. And that was what this project was designed to do. And so as part of this project, I basically handed her the reins, said, what is it that you want to do? What is it that you are curious about? And she came back, she's like, I've always wanted to develop my own clothing line. What do I need to do in order to do that? And so building the foundation on design thinking and showing her the ropes on how she can pursue it, she reached out to textile designers. She reached out to brand owners. She reached out to a number of experts within the field to ask, how do you go about doing this business? And from not having a sense of how to start, she not only understood and developed her own logo, her own brand, her own conversations with these experts, but actually made product. And not only that, she had the courage to go to her friends and prototype and ask, would you buy something like this? Should I create it? And then went on prototyping that, creating a hoodie with her own brand and logo and design, and wearing it to her dance performance. And so this shows the arc that someone who's academically excellent has other interests, other things that they can pursue should we as educators give them the rein and give them the really the agency to pursue their interest.
mm. That is such an inspiring story. And I personally use design thinking a lot in my own work. And in fact, I do have a clothing brand in mind. So as I was
Mm.
listening, I mean, this really speaks to my heart. That's a passion project that I will bring to life someday. I really want us to dive into the AI landscape of the modern world. We educate youth in unprecedented times, and AI is really entering the education spaces, as you mentioned. Um, but these systems, I feel like, just like any technology, AI is not neutral. Any technology is really shaped by the bias of people who build them, the data that they themselves are trained on, and the interests that usually fund them. Before we really explore how modern youth should engage with I wanted to ask you, Asad, who is actually funding AI, if you have that information, and what should we understand around the influence behind the systems?
Absolutely. And such a fundamental question. Having worked across different systems, one of the first things I do entering a new system uh, is to understand the funding landscape. The funding
Mm,
landscape really describes where the power is, where the decisions can be made, and who are involved in those decision making. And so I want to start off by saying a few years ago, I worked on a project called Towards Global Learning Goals. It was a project that was based out of uh, New York University in Abu Dhabi, led by a former British ambassador, Tom Fletcher. And part of this project, the entire curiosity was what is the role of technology companies, governments, and education institutions? Really, that triangle, and
mm,
how do they work together? And I mentioned that because even now, as we think about the funding landscape of AI, it is again some of those same players within the space that are funding AI. And so, and most of this information is public, and so it can be searched very easily. But you have the big tech. companies like Microsoft, Google, Amazon, Meta, they have their own AI platforms, but they all have investment in education-based AI tools. You have VC firms that are, again, generally VC firms are known for investing, scaling, and then really wanting to exit from their investments. And so again, different VC firms have different priorities, but generally
Mhm.
there are VCs. Then you have countries. There's a lot of countries in the Middle East,
Mhm.
including Doha, that and Qatar, that are investing in AI heavily to bring in technologies to be able to really advance how they're imagining their education system, and then be able to spread that across other systems as well, not only just education. And then obviously you have governments that have their own priorities within education. And so those are some of the big categories of funders that are funding in this space. And I think one thing to highlight there is that every one of those funding categories and funders have their own priorities.
Mhm.
And none of those priorities are what should a 14-year-old student be learning and developing, right? Everyone has their own priorities. And so we have to really sit down and think, what is that 14-year-old student's and who's looking at their priorities?
Mhm. And
And
that
then one
really,
thing, oh, sorry
Mhm.
about that. And one thing I'll add is these tools in these education institutions are typically free.
Mhm.
Um, and that is a question. One of the things, as I mentioned, is follow the funding. And the funding says that when something is free, someone is paying. So it's either you're paying with your data, with your consent, by being marketed to. There is someone who's paying for it. And so then the question becomes is what is their intention behind that free tool, right? It could be where they want to develop a workforce pipeline. It could be where there's data that can be used to keep folks engaged longer. It can be a variety of things, but nothing's ever free. And so that's
Mhm.
something that can always be kept in the forefront of the mind.
Mhm. Thank you for articulating it so clearly because that's really important. I learned during my dissertation studies that we really need to closely follow the money to understand who actually funded any research and who's oftentimes, and I don't want to say every research is like this, but oftentimes the findings really represent the interest of the group that funded the research. And so that awareness really shifted the way I approached my own research process. And I think when it comes to technologies that have such immense power, especially as AI, that question is so critical. With that being said, I want to ask you, what questions does it raise around ethics, trust, and responsibility as these tools are introduced in the learning environments to young people? How is that? What kind of a discussion or maybe discourse is happening around that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's fundamental. I think the conversation around ethics, trust, and responsibility is something that is an ever going conversation. It's something when in the world of research and qualitative research, we talk about all the time. How do we
Mm,
ensure the privacy of people that are engaging in research? How do we honor them? How do we ensure we're using trauma-informed research? The conversations are essentially the same within the world of AI.
mm,
However, it looks very different. How does it look different? Back in the day, the educators would be overwhelmed by ed tech companies. Use our
mhm,
tool, it's going to reduce your burnout. Use our tool, it's going to increase in efficiency. Use our tool, there's going to be better outputs. And I remember when I used to talk to these teachers working in the school system, they would be tired. They were like,
mhm,
no, not another one. Oh no, I got it. And what that means is these teachers are inundated with these technology tools.
mhm,
Now, what has happened is the tools have changed. Now it's all about AI tools. And so the pattern is still the same. There's ed tech, there's LMS, now there's AI tools, and all of them are asking teachers to buy, or asking
mhm,
leaders to buy. And so the first and fundamental question is, are the educators, leaders, teachers aware of what they're buying? Can they, in simple terms, explain to a parent what their child is going through in terms of these tools. I recently had a conversation, and this was in context of UAE, where a friend of mine, his children are in elementary school, and the situation was that his child was exposed to adult material on school tablet
Mm,
as
mm,
part of an ad that the school had no control over. And so when he had a conversation with them, they said, we are ensuring all of these safety measures. However, something in the technology uh, missed it, skipped it, something happened where he was furious as he should
mm,
be. But
mm,
that's the thing we're thinking about is how do we ensure things like that aren't happening? Things that perhaps even educators don't have control over when now we are bringing in a set of tools that are evolving so rapidly. What happens
mm,
when you have tools and situations like that happen? Because the impact will be there
mm,
regardless.
mm, mm. Yes, absolutely. And even I feel like if there are firewalls, their security is ensured. There's the other side of AI usage these days. As I engage myself, I feel like the AI outputs are so agreeable, right? They are so confident, sometimes persuasive, very human. And the question that comes up in my mind oftentimes, even as an adult using these tools, what does it mean to develop true discernment as a learner in this kind of environment? And how should education systems truly cultivate it? As a young person, how do I discern the information that I truly engage with, that I can trust and I should be acting upon, and something that will be probably getting me in trouble, even if it's not as obvious as the example that you just shared?
Yeah, absolutely. And the reality is discernment is a muscle that you have to
Mm,
develop. It doesn't, it's something that over time we're going to learn, but there are ways to help nurture those. And so a young person has the ability, and I think first and foremost, we have to recognize that students have their own minds and their own thoughts. And as educators, we're trying to guide them. And
mhm,
so when we're thinking about this idea of, well, how do you discern the reality from falsehood, as an example, right? There are a lot of instances nowadays where you have to go and what they call fact check the
mhm,
information. Um, why do you have to fact check? The reality is there is so much misinformation. And so, with that caveat that everyone knows there is misinformation and you have to fact check, AI is putting that human touch to it. It's making it sound nice.
mhm,
But an expert who really understands and has those that discernment muscle developed will know if it's right or wrong. However, as students are getting into education and learning, they still don't have that determined. But what they can do is, and what educators can do is really help them experiment and learn within a safe zone. And I'll give you an example.
mhm,
There's an educator who I was recently speaking to who teaches at NYU, teaches research at NYU, and I asked, "How are you seeing AI within your work?" And so what she simply put was that, look, initially I was like, no AI.
mhm,
Or then it went to the next stage, AI with you're putting your thought processes together. And then she realizes everyone's using it anyways. And then she's like, okay, you're going to use it. So let's put some parameters around that. And so she started putting parameters. And soon what it became obvious was that you have students that are using it. The output is fantastic. And then students that aren't using it 100%, they are learning and they are really becoming critical thinkers. So that practice is
mhm,
going in, but their
mhm,
output might not be the same. And then in the university setting or as educator, she has to measure output as one of the criterias.
mhm,
Um, and so then it's becoming this. uneven playground of, are you actually measuring the output? Are you measuring the learning? And what do you become as a critical thinker, right? And I think those components are butting heads very
Mhm.
frequently for educators, but that's also the reality. And that's something where the educators then have to say, okay, what is my role in this space?
Mhm. And you're really speaking to the fact that the educator's role is changing and how we approach the teacher and the student dynamics is completely different now. And AI largely is disrupting edtech in general, but AI largely is disrupting the dynamics. And before you spoke about the different edtech initiatives, and I witnessed those being brought into the school system one after another, and the teachers almost have developed the immunity and they started treating it as another initiative that will pass, right? So the initiative
Mhm.
fatigue is very real. And the way we bring this new technology, because there's really no way around it, as you said, the
Mhm.
students will be using, and we've gone through that wave with phones. I remember when the administration banned the phones, they were not allowed, especially middle school and high school, but the kids were finding ways to use it and getting in a lot of trouble. So then they had to put some rules around it and how to actually create meaningful engagement in an academic setting with the gadgets that they would bring to school anyway. And I think the same thing is true for AI. So thank you for speaking to that. Um, as that traditional education systems were really designed for stability, predictability, and preparing students for defined outcomes, as we discussed earlier. But we are now entering a phase where it's going to be more uncertainty, frequent reskilling demand, and constant reinvention. And I think that is accelerating as the time goes. What needs to fundamentally shift in how we educate and prepare our youth and Mother Day? What do you think? What is your opinion around that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll start off by pushing back a little bit on the framing. I don't think everything needs to shift within the traditional education system. The
Mhm.
discipline of showing up, exposure to ideas you haven't really chosen or explored yet, learning alongside other human beings, those still matter. I think the fact that in colleges here, you have general education classes, gives you a level of exposure where I had so many of my peers shift their educational pathway and direction because they got exposure versus in some other countries, they might not even have those general education. They're directly going in one direction.
Mhm.
However, the pathway, as you mentioned, is very uncertain. Professors nowadays are saying, what am I preparing my students for? I, if in the researcher professor I mentioned earlier, in her case, she was preparing these graduate students for a career in research. And now there are AI tools that are available that are eliminating those kinds of research positions. And so, what are the current professors doing in trying to upskill these students? Now, when we think about what have we fallen behind on, is really training students on the aspect of navigating uncertainty. The reality of life is change is inevitable. And so, how do we help students understand that inevitable reality of change and the uncertainty that brings about? As educators and mentors and guides, that is our responsibility. And so let me give an example of how a school that I previously worked at is navigating some of those components around AI. Design Tech High School, the executive director, Ken, recently posted about the fact that Design Tech High School, that is based in the Bay Area, that is on the campus of Oracle, so really in the heart of these conversations around AI, they were developing their AI framework. And one of the things they did in developing that is that they engaged students in the conversation as to what needs to happen as they're developing those frameworks, right? And when we think about this conversation, it's not only students' use of AI, but
Mhm.
it's also teachers' use of AI.
Mhm.
And so I'm gonna read one of their quotes that they said. They said that um, let me quickly say, so when a teacher uses AI to create an assignment or a grade in, the classroom shifts from, and this is the part they coded, we're doing this together to I'm doing this.
Mm,
And that's the shift that AI is bringing about in frankly a negative light, right? And so where the students from Design Tech High School said is that AI is in its own place, but we want the learners and the students to be centered. We don't want the technology to center output. We want technology to center us as learners. And that was how they're approaching in the conversation around AI framework. And I think that is key and fundamental because now, as Design Tech High School is doing this so gracefully, is they're bringing students, they're providing them the agency, and they're also co-designing some of these things. Because as we're talking, sometimes educators and leaders are also learning on this journey as AI
mhm,
is transforming so rapidly. And so, who best to help us create than the students who are actually also learning, creating, and impacted by it?
mhm. That was a beautiful response, and really how AI is reshaping the classroom dynamics in the sense that there's no longer teacher learner, we're co learners and co designers of the learning experience. It's almost like leveling out this playing field and entering all like it's almost empowers us to enter into this space as learners because we're all learning how to navigate the world of AI and how to use it as a tool. And you recently, Asad, participated in a global platform, WISE, in Doha, which advances innovation in education to address the gap between the current systems and future needs. I am curious, what felt most urgent in those conversations? Where do you think this is headed in terms of the implementation of AI in education and particularly into K-12 schools?
Yeah, such a good question and such a timely question. WISE took place. WISE is a conference that takes place every 2 years, and so this year, last November, when it took place, you really felt the globalization of AI because any workshop, any panel I would go into, regardless of people coming in either from China, Singapore, uh, Middle East, Southeast Asia, everyone was talking about AI. And I would say it, in some ways, was overwhelmingly conversation around AI. However, the theme of the conference was how do we make AI human?
Mhm.
Somewhere around those lines. And that was a very interesting framing because it was sort of like this acceptance that AI is here, everyone's using it, we are in the middle of that, but let's not move our eyes away from AI. And
Mhm.
so within this, there's two different spectrums I want to talk about. The first spectrum is about the world of misinformation that I brought on earlier. This is
Mhm.
again something that not only students, educators, but as humans we're faced with. The example that I want to highlight, and this is in the forefront of my mind, this was presented by AJ Plus. This was, I believe it's Al Jazeera, one of their groups,
Mhm.
and they showcase as part of their workshop this images of news broadcasters. And the
Mhm.
question they asked is, are they real or are they fake? And everyone's like, what? Obviously they're real, as they had played part of the video. And then he stopped and said, okay, let's look at it again. And slowly by slowly, as we peel back the layer, we realize that the news broadcasters were all AI generated. And within each one, they also showcase that, look, in this one, AI, these were things that gave away that it was an AI generated image. And then in the other iterations, they were getting so good that it was harder to even recognize as AI generated. And obviously, we more recently have had where some of these AI tools, if a image is AI generated, it has to be tagged, right? And so we are going into some of those regulatory components. Um, but that is a huge component, which is on one end of the spectrum of how AI is being utilized. On the other end of the spectrum, you have organizations that are really tackling global world learning crisis, right?
Mhm.
And on the other spectrum, this organization that I'm thinking of was building community centers where community teachers, students can come together. And this was happening in some parts of Africa. And within that in-person space where you have this community being built, they're using AI-powered assistant which is helping educators, one, helping the teachers educate, but two, on the flip end, the actual students can engage through voice and they're able to learn in different ways, right? And then the third component of this was working with private, government, and um, educational institutions to make funding available for more work, right? And so now in this example, you see that it's not about just AI as a tool, but rather AI is being embedded in a community space where now there is community being built around education. As we know, some of those educations happen in person, and the power of that, but also seeing
Mhm.
how can we bring in additional resources while we're building these tools up from many different funders to make the work sustainable and really tackle the global crisis that is on hand.
Mhm. You're really speaking to, I think, access also that AI is changing because education has always been an opportunity, like a pathway to different opportunities, especially economic opportunities. And as AI is entering the space, it's reshaping work, it's also changing access and global
Mhm.
participation, as you mentioned. Globalization was one of the main topics. Um, With that, I want to ask you because having worked in different school districts, we always, our slogan or our motto or our promise has always been to prepare students for their future. So, with everything happening in the landscape of education and particularly AI entering it so quickly, how does future readiness is really changing? What does it really mean now? This is what I'm wondering as an educator. What is future readiness really looks like, considering everything that's happening in the educational landscape, particularly with AI?
Yeah, yeah. It's so interesting. Most people use future readiness as a code where it's sort of like, yeah, they can get job and they can have a stable life in the future. And in many different communities, particularly immigrant communities, they tend to like stable jobs. And so
Mhm.
these days, when you think about stable jobs, I mean, I remember the past decade becoming a software engineer was a very, very stable and lucrative positions where many of my friends who were not software engineers would go to boot camps and become software engineers. And so now, with some of the recent layoffs by the tech companies, we see that something that was perceived to be stable for many, many, many decades to come is no longer the situation. And so, future readiness, really, in my mind, is a couple of things. One is, um, well, I would say it starts off with self-awareness. And so self-awareness is one of those components where, as we talked about the student, Rachel, she was self-aware that she likes creativity, she likes dance. And some of those aspects of self-awareness led to this idea that it could be something else. There are other possibilities, other opportunities. The second part of that is experiential. In Rachel's case, she wanted to try out that clothing line. And so through experience, she was able to iterate and figure out what's working and what's not working. And that also meant by going and talking to experts that are in the field and doing the work, and really building a perspective and an opinion that is not a singular source of information, but rather it's through different experiences and understanding different perspectives. And then I think the third component of that is emotional intelligence.
Mhm.
EQ is one of those components where they say it's something that is hard to develop, but I believe it is something that is fundamental with where we are going, where we're heading, and it's something that as we look at children, they're very smart. They
Mhm.
always outsmart their parents, that's for
Mhm.
sure. And so the question becomes as well, if we are measuring it, how are we thinking about measuring it? And what is our role in measuring it? And because measuring doesn't actually address future readiness, because what we need is we need self-aware students that now understand through experience where they want to go and what they want to do. And I'll give you an example. I recently encountered an individual who is educated in physical therapy, worked over 10, 15, over 10 years, so close to 15 years, and recently migrated to the US. Now, as we know, in theory, it's a stable work. However, in the world of globalization and regulation of governments, he wasn't able to practice here because what his education level was not sufficient for what you require in the US. And so he pivoted to a different career that's skill-based and became an electrician.
Mhm.
And it's very interesting because in the job market trend, one of the things that is increasing is showing some of those skill and technical skills, such as electricians and plumbers, are actually going to be on a rise in the future. And
Mhm.
so he not only tapped into his own ability, but he was aware of his environment and the future trajectory. And now he is as busy as ever. And
Mhm.
that shows to itself how that aspect of self-awareness, emotional intelligence, and experience comes together.
Mhm. Such a good example. And I think in my own experience and working with educators, I see the rise in the demand in vocational fields and really those skill-based careers that were always looked at as less than because the push was always for a college degree. And there's nothing wrong with that. We still want it. But I think that self-awareness to understand
Mhm.
what's truly mine, what do I really enjoy, what I'm good at, like, and in what ways do I want to contribute to the society? That really becomes key in the work that we do with our youth, and particularly me as a coach. I see that over and over that the young people want to find what's truly mine, what's not trendy, what's not even more lucrative. It's what's truly authentically mine. And that's definitely a reason for celebration. And as you mentioned, Asad, as AI is increasingly becoming part of young people's learning and thinking, and even ways of expression, like you can record your voice as if it's singing, you can write with AI, and that's one of the higher cognitive skills that gets outsourced. I find quite often one of the first ones to be outsourced. So almost becomes a means of self-expression. And I'm curious, in your opinion, in your experience, how do you see this impacting or helping shape the student's sense of identity, voice, and ultimately their relationships in the world, whether it's personal or professional down the road?
Absolutely, absolutely. And this is so interesting, right? Because developing identity takes time. It takes
Mhm.
effort. It takes guidance. It takes a lot of failure. I recently was in a conversation with someone who runs this workshop for senior leaders, saying, "How do you stay in your failures?" Because we all have a tendency of saying, "Okay, I'm failing, but this is how I changed a failure into a success." And her entire argument is that there is so much value in staying within failure. And taking that back to developing our identity, there's two aspects to it. More often than not, these days, if I ask a question from colleagues or friends, I get uh, starking repeatedly the same answer saying, "Did you ask AI?" And I'm
Mhm.
like, okay, I'm trying to have a conversation. Why do I need to ask AI? And when we think about that aspect of ask AI, ask AI, ask AI, what this leads to is we have so many people that are interacting with AI robots, are
Mhm.
interacting with AI tools. I mean, we have the driverless cars, we have drones that are developing groceries and other products. And so, what it's also leading into is this aspect of isolation.
Mhm.
And Ask AI is just another example of that. Is that if I want to be in community, there's a push saying AI has information. Why are you asking me and wasting my time? And my pushback to that is we are social creatures and we interact and learn from each other. And the fact that we ask AI is actually, in sometimes, um, limiting us in building that social emotional connection. There might be
Mm,
more information, but there is something to be said about social emotional connection. I mean, I have a toddler, and one of the things I learned early on is half of their learning is happening by seeing how I react. Not only how I say, but what my facial expression says, how I'm showing up, my temperament, my way of dressing, everything is impacting and shaping their identity. And so when we
mm,
come back to this aspect of identity and voice and relationships, we have to really ask the question and say, how do we better understand ourselves to begin with? And then from there, say, how do we actually build authentic relationship? Because again, yes, perhaps you don't need to ask that question from your friend. You can ask AI, but there is this aspect of learning and co-creating within community, and really thinking about this idea of how do you claim that stillness? You
mm,
have this overflow of information coming in, but in order to process that information, you need to stay still. Um,
mm,
Even the fact that there's conversation around let kids get bored is a weird one, but it's true.
mm,
In the day of being inundated with so much information and content all the time, there's actually a market and business out there for apps that stop notifications from showing up on your phone.
mm,
Seriously, there's an entire suite of apps. Why? Because there is so much information. We just have to start pulling them back and
mm,
being able to process information we have and be able to think about what we do, how we do, and how we show up. And it's a challenging, but also a time full of opportunity to learn and grow, and sometimes challenge the status quo as well.
mm. And I think the status quo is being challenged in a major way just because of the acceleration of change and transformation. We're officially in transformation economy. I was reading in some news outlets, and I just recently got a book about transformation economy. So really, what does it mean to be a human and develop as a human in this reality, in this new reality? And thank you for voicing so beautifully the risk of isolation and how we unintentionally empower people to engage more with AI rather than with people. And my sons are an example of that. I have two sons, they're in late 20s and early 30s. And when I go to them with a question, and both are brilliant, very successful, oftentimes they would say, Mom, did you ask AI? And I don't allow it to hurt my feelings, but I finally express that this is a way we have beautiful relationship, but this is a way for us to continuously engage. Yes, I can find the answers, but I'm really curious. I'm really interested in your take in this from your experience, your way of thinking, your knowledge, and everything else. I want the answer from you.
Mhm, mhm,
And so, really continuing for us to cultivate those relationships, like you said, we are shaping young people around us by what we embody, right? Everything, our entire neurophysiology is engaged in parenting. It's not only what we say or do. And I think that needs to be brought to awareness even more in these times. And that's really what I'm trying to do with wholeness education, which is all about cultivating the inner architecture of the future
mhm,
human, as I call it, because historically, those people who were self-aware, emotionally intelligent, did engage in experiential learning, they end up being very successful, regardless of the time that they were growing up in. And I think now it's even more critical as our youth grows up alongside technology. The risks are real, risks
mhm,
of isolation, risk of being overpowered by the outputs of technology, but at the same time, there's very real gains and opportunities, as you said, for youth to expand their capacity if they know exactly how to use those tools strategically and very consciously. And that's why I wanted for us to have this conversation, and have your expertise and wisdom that comes from the field and having done this work for many years to really speak into this space. What does it mean to engage with AI as a young person in the most conscious and strategic way to empower yourself to be the best that you can be? And with that, I want to ask probably the last question for today, Asad. We're at a moment where education can either evolve to meet this new reality, because we're already in this new reality, or reinforce some outdated models. And I see that happening as well. So if we zoom out and just kind of look from above, from a 10,000-foot view, what does it truly mean for education to support a young person in living into their full potential in this particular era in human evolution? And what kind of future are we shaping if we don't consciously make that shift?
Yeah, such a fundamental question, right? It's really thinking about everything we talked about, zooming back, thinking about the funding, the conditions, the tools, the educators, the students. There's one word underneath all, which is co-design. We're
Mm,
all learners and we are all in this together. The change is happening very, very rapidly. And for a young person to realize their full potential in this era really means that they have to become co-designers, and not only co-designers of tools in their learning, but of who they're becoming and of their relationships and the tools they're generating. They have to become builders. They have to, it's not about consumption, but rather building. And
mhm,
ultimately, the future they want to live in is what they have to build. It's sort of a blank slate all over again.
mhm,
And so now they have the opportunity to do that. And so, really, the way I like to frame it is they're moving from being a recipient to a co-designer, from being a
mhm,
passenger to an author. And so, it's really exciting, but also
mhm,
there's always a little bit of anxiousness in change, and change is very, very difficult. And so when we think about it, the teachers want the best outcomes for children, for students. Um, in the child welfare space where we work, there's shift happening towards, and the term that's being used is child well-being and family well-being. And so across systems and across board, I see that there's best intention in place, even if sometimes outcomes aren't what
mhm,
it was intended. But I think the intention is there, and so we have to take that stance of really co-designing our own lives and taking the rein in our own hand, and uh, remembering the story of Rachel and saying that once we have the reign, we can really design our own life and tell the story from that perspective. And AI can, I always think about it this way. Everything has the black and the white, but the gray space is where magic happens. And so AI in a lot of those places can be that magic that can help us challenge a lot of things as it already is challenging status quo. But there
mhm,
is this aspect that it's moving so fast that regulations and governance and all of those things are falling behind. And so there is real risk on how it can impact, but if we have that agency, if we have that discernment, it can really help us.
mhm. Thank you for that beautiful summarizing answer. And I think we're just being pushed, just naturally catalyzed to go from a passenger to a driver, from a consumer to a creator, and just truly becoming a author of your own life and whatever you want to bring to this world. So thank you so much for bringing your lived experience, your wisdom, and just the perspectives that you share around AI use and education around AI into this space. Very, very valuable. Is there anything else, Asad, that you would like to share with our audience that maybe I did not ask about?
I think the questions were fantastic, so really appreciate it. And thank you for having me. I think the only thing I would add is um, an aspect around fear. And many people are afraid of AI, and many people are afraid of change. And I think the best situations can come when we lean into some of the fear. And sometimes I say that the sandbox is somewhere we can test and experiment and learn within. And it is an opportunity. And everything can be an opportunity or can be a challenge. And so it is that at that point and pivotal point, as you mentioned, we're in the transformation economy, is that everyone can it can level things for many people in terms of access, but also recognize that what we have in terms of access and ability is a privilege, and that we should work from a stance of gratitude and then be able to really understand what is our role within all of this.
Thank you. Beautifully stated. It really brings back to ownership of what is it that you're willing to do, what you're handed with, and fear is part of it. And it's everlasting tension between fear and opportunity, between change and growth, right? And growth does not happen without discomfort, and that's I think an essential skill, especially for young people to embrace, because many of them are challenged in my work that I see many of them are challenged with uncertainty and being able to stay grounded in change. And so cultivating those human, deeply human, and maybe uniquely human skills becomes ever more critical, as we discussed throughout the conversation. Thank you once again for this insightful dialogue. If our audience is interested to learn more about your work, where can they find you?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having me. I am always happy to have a conversation. So I can be found at Asad Bandeali on my LinkedIn page, or folks can go to my business page, asparkconsult.com. Aspark Consulting is the name of the business, and happy to dream, imagine, and provide guidance as I'm on this journey of learning and happy to learn alongside.
Thank you so very much again for sharing this space with me, for the insights that you've brought into our dialogue. I want to remind our audience that all the information that Asad just shared will be under this video on YouTube, so you can easily reach out to him. Thank you once again for everything that you brought into this space. It was a true honor to share this exploration with you, and I really hope for future discourses around more critical topics as things evolve, and we can always come back, I hope, and share more wisdom and more practical tools with our audience.
So thank you.
And thank you for being with us today. I'm grateful for each one of you tuning into today's conversation, and I sincerely hope that you found it insightful and valuable. Please remember to subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet to never miss an episode. I will see you next time.